In now.
Sure.
Welcome to everybody just joining us now. If you just bear with us for a moment, we're going to begin shortly, and I'm just letting everybody in from the waiting room. And we'll begin in just a minute or two. For everyone new just joining us, thanks so much. If you just bear with us just a moment, we'll begin in just another minute. I'm just letting everybody in from the waiting room, allowing people to slowly trickle in. All right, well, it looks like we've got a big group today, which is very exciting. Hopefully we can get some nice dialogue going at the end of the presentation, which will be very exciting. So I just want to thank you all again so much for coming to our virtual talk today. If I could remind you to just please keep yourselves muted throughout the presentation, unless Eleanor, our presenter today, our docent, invites any kind of discussion or dialogue, then feel free to unmute yourself. If you'd prefer, there's a chat box feature at the bottom of the screen, and you can also use that throughout the presentation. We'll be monitoring those, and at the end of the presentation, I can relay those questions for you if you'd like. If you're joining us over Facebook Live, welcome to you as well. You can also use our question and comment feature on the chat box feature on Facebook Live, and we'll answer those questions at the end of the program as well. If I could just remind everyone that this talk is being recorded and streamed live and will be posted to our social media channels once the talk is over. And if you'd like to rewatch this talk or watch previous virtual tours and talks, please check out our YouTube and our Facebook pages. And with that, I'm excited to introduce to you our speaker, Eleanor, and today her talk is entitled Jan van Eyck, Alchemist of Art. So I'll hand it over to you, Eleanor.
Thank you, Blythe. Excuse me. And welcome, everyone. Welcome to today's virtual tour of the Tinkham Museum. My name is Eleanor Merle. I'm a docent with the museum, and I'm delighted to be with you today for a deep dive into what are considered Jan van Eyck's two greatest works. Part artist, part alchemist, and some might claim part magician. The legacy of the artist Jan van Eyck is shrouded in both mystery and legend. In his work, he achieved an astonishingly sophisticated level of realism, heretofore unknown in the art of painting. Glimmering jewels, reflective metals, lush satins and velvets, and even human flesh were each rendered with their own distinctive qualities. With such a high degree of naturalism, it seemed he had conjured a new artistic medium. Of his circa 20 extant works, two stand out as so remarkable in their iconography and symbolism that they continue to intrigue scholars to this day. And they are, of course, the Ghent altarpiece and the Arnolfini portrait. We'll explore these two works considering the questions that have kept art historians guessing for the past 6 centuries. Despite van Eyck's fame, most of his biography remains shrouded in mystery. What we do know is that his family were members of the gentry. They were well off, and he was sought after by the most brilliant patrons of his day, including the Duke of Burgundy, Philip the Good, for whom he was appointed court painter and chamberlain around 1425. He remained in Philip's service until his death in Bruges in June 1441. The sophistication of Van Eyck's iconography, which demonstrates an understanding of complicated theological arguments, suggests that he had received a high level of education. We'll begin our discussion with the Ghent altarpiece, the first truly great masterpiece using a pure oil paint technique, and the world's most stolen work of art. More to come on that. The subject of both imitation and pilgrimage, the altarpiece was well known throughout Europe, even within the artist's lifetime. When in 1432, churchgoers first gazed upon the Ghent altarpiece, they would have been astounded by its unprecedented naturalism. Even 600 years later, in an era of photorealistic animation, we cannot deny Jan van Eyck's supreme ability to mimic reality. By the end of the 15th century, visitors were already paying to see this famous painting in the chapel. The altarpiece was commissioned by wealthy patrician Jodocus Vid and his wife Lisbeth Borluut, and was originally intended as the altarpiece for the family chapel in the Church of St. John the Baptist in Ghent, Belgium. It was reconstructed as St. Bavo Cathedral between 1559 and 69. The altarpiece consists of 12 oak panels with 8 that are hinged on shutters and painted on both sides. We know this, one moment. Until the altarpiece was painted, only portrait miniatures had illuminated manuscripts contained such detail. Nothing like this intricacy had ever been seen before. And the great art historian Erwin Panofsky famously wrote that Van Eyck's eye functioned, and I quote, as a microscope and a telescope at the same time. Viewers of the Ghent altarpiece, Panofsky explained, are privy to God's vision of the world, capturing, and I quote, some of the experience of him who looks down from heaven, but can number the hairs on our head, end quote. The secret weapon that permitted such detail, color saturation, and luminosity was oil paint. And though Van Eyck didn't invent oil paint, he was the first artist to exploit its true capabilities. He used the medium to greater effect than any other artist to date. Although the Ghent altarpiece is considered to be Jan van Eyck's greatest masterpiece, the painting was, in fact, a collaboration between Jan and his older brother, Hubert. We know this because of an inscribed Latin quatrain, which was discovered in 1823 at the base of the altarpiece. Translated, the poem reads as follows. The painter Hubert van Eyck, a greater man than whom cannot be found, began this work. Jan, his brother, second in art, completed this weighty task at the request of Jus Vid. He invites you with this verse on the 6th of May, 1432, to look at what has been done. And that's the end of that quatrain. Now, Jan van Eyck would not be Van Eyck if he didn't do something special with this quatrain. So in the last line, a number of letters have been marked. And if you add up the Roman numerical value of these letters, you get the number 1432, the year in which the Ghent altarpiece was revealed. Sadly, Hubert van Eyck died in 1426, 1 year after receiving the commission for the work. It's thought he contributed to the compositional design, with Jan van Eyck completing it after his death. While we know a lot about Jan van Eyck as he rose to international fame during his lifetime and garnered substantial renown in the centuries that followed, significantly less is known about Hubert van Eyck. In addition to being arguably the most influential painting ever made, the altarpiece has the dubious distinction of being the most frequently stolen artwork in history, the object of 13 crimes in its almost 600-year lifespan. This is particularly remarkable considering that the entire hinged assembly measures about 11.5 feet by 15 feet, and it weighs more than a ton. One painting, the lower left panel of the open altarpiece, was pilfered in 1934 and never recovered. A copy stands in its place. And believe it or not, Ghent in Belgium still has a prosecutor and 2 police investigators who are tasked with solving the crime almost a century later. It was last stolen by Adolf Hitler in World War II, who hid it with thousands of other looted artworks in a converted salt mine in Austria. The local SS commander had wired the mine with dynamite, determined to destroy all the art as the Allies began closing in. The altarpiece was rescued from the Nazis in 1945 through the heroism of salt miners who disabled the bombs and by a team of Allied miners and commando double agents known as the Monuments Men, who reassembled, cleaned, and restored the panels, which had lost much of their varnish and had suffered some surface abrasion. You may have seen that movie with George Clooney. So let's start our journey through the altarpiece with it in its closed position. As the Ghent altarpiece was only open during Mass, it would have spent most of its early life closed, and when shut, the altarpiece displays 3 core scenes: donor portraits, imitation statues, and an impressive Annunciation scene. On the top row are 2 sibyls or angels flanked by 2 Old Testament prophets, and they're watching the heralding of the Annunciation from above. These 4 figures are all messengers of the incarnation and sacrifice of Christ. In the middle row, Archangel Gabriel delivers the news of Jesus's birth to Mary on the right. The angel carries a lily, symbolic of the Virgin, and recites the words, "Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee." And that's written in gold script across the panel. Mary responds with a gesture of submission, while a symbol of the holy dove floats above her head. Her response is written upside down and backwards, presumably so God could read it. In the center, the wooden supports of the panels cast shadows onto the floor, and there's a view out the windows toward a Flemish town. In the bottom row, outer left and right panels are the donors. As I mentioned, Jodocus or Juice Vid and his wife, Lisbeth or Elizabeth Borloo, and they're painted in red. And my understanding is that's to depict that they are living. Between the donor portraits are 2 painted statues, John the Baptist left holding a lamb and John the Evangelist on the right holding a chalice. Now, at the time of the Ghent altarpiece's conception, its intended church wasn't yet the cathedral dedicated to St. Bavo, but it was rather the Church of St. John the Baptist. So it makes sense that one of the 2 statues on the exterior panels would depict John the Baptist, as well as the other prominent saint that shared his name. The realism of the statues, which seemingly project from their inscribed plinths, is partly due to Jan van Eyck's employment of the technique of grisaille. And this is the method of painting entirely in black, white, and gray monotones. Grisaille was most commonly used to mimic sculpture, and these panels are the first documented instance of painted sculpture on the exterior of an altarpiece. Like most Renaissance patrons, Jodocus Vide was a wealthy merchant who sought to expiate the sin of being too fond of money by spending some of it on creating a monument to God in his home city as a means of saving his soul while simultaneously celebrating his wealth. It's uncertain the extent to which he influenced the iconography of the overall work, but he obviously spared no expense. And we can marvel once again at Van Eyck's realism to the extent that we can see the blemishes on Vide's face. It was conventional to make an altarpiece's exterior panels monochromatic, even dull in color, to directly contrast with the colorful panels inside. When open, the altarpiece consists of 2 rows depicting Christ's sacrifice and the redemption of man. The opened altarpiece portrays a glorious image of Christ's second coming when he returns to judge the living and the dead. While medieval Last Judgments emphasized damnation with the horrors of hell it depicted, Van Eyck's painting focuses on redemption and humanity's joyous return to paradise. We travel accompanied by prophets on foot and princes on horseback, saints and martyrs, and more angels to the brilliantly colored heart of the scene depicting the adoration of the mystic Lamb. It's as if the makers of The Wizard of Oz derived their inspiration for a black and white canvas and a Technicolor Oz from Ghent. The adoration of the mystic Lamb is presided over by God the Father or Christ, and there's been controversy and debates about whether this depiction is God the Father or Christ. And he is flanked by separate panels of John the Baptist to the right and the Virgin Mary to the left. The combination of these 3 figures reminds us of a Byzantine image type, the deesis, from the Greek prayer, which shows the intercession of the Virgin Mary and St. John the Baptist for the salvation of our souls. All 3 figures are richly ornamented, dripping in gold embroidered drapery and shining gems. It's a wonderfully ornate image, and behind each of the figures are claws of honor made from cloth of gold. Luxury textiles were probably the most expensive item you could buy in Renaissance Europe, making them fitting backdrops for a heavenly portrait. Moving outward from the center is perhaps one of the most incredible aspects of the Ghent altarpiece, and that's the angelic musicians. Believe it or not, Jan van Eyck's attention to detail is so accurate and precise that we can tell what notes are being played on the organ. And historians have also noted that we can tell which of the singing angels is a soprano, an alto, a tenor, or a bass, simply through their painted expressions. On the outermost upper panels are Adam and Eve, God's first human creatures. They're the parenthetical figures of this upper register and those that necessitate the salvation scene below. Their literal marginalization at the edges of the altarpiece is indicative of their state of sin. They symbolize the whole of humanity, which the Lamb will redeem from sin and death. Eve holds the forbidden fruit, which is not an apple, but a citrus fruit, which may be an allusion to the bitterness of the fall. These stunning life-size portraits of Adam and Eve are the first ever large-scale nude portraits in Northern Europe, and they're among the most naturalistic of all male nudes and female nudes of the European Renaissance. The illusion of reality is so strong that Adam appears about to step out from his painted world into our own. Above their heads are illusionist bas reliefs showing the murder of Abel by his brother Cain, the first consequence of the couple's sin and the first instance of murder in the Bible. As the top row is dominated by the central portrayal of God, the lower half is dominated by probably the most famous painting in the altarpiece, which is the Adoration of the Mystic Lamb, showing the sacrifice of the Lamb of God, a symbol for Christ. Here we see the Eucharistic sacrifice of the mystic lamb placed on an altar surrounded by 14 angels and set in a fertile meadow hedged with bushes on the outskirts of a city. The faithful converge from all four corners of the earth, representing humanity's joyous return to paradise. And again, in contrast to medieval images, there are no images of the damned here. Instead, the focus is on the blessed whose sins have been forgiven. Now, in the far right, lower right, is you saw a group of martyrs, and you can distinguish Saint Levinus in the center, recognized by the pincers and tongue that he is holding. He was the patron saint of Ghent, and during a sermon in S, his tongue was torn out by a group of heathens. The lamb bleeds from a wound in its side, and this stream of blood flows directly into a chalice set on the altar cloth. And the full inscription on the altar cloth reads, it is in Latin, it reads, "Here is the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world." The flowing of the blood, visually linked to the spouts of water in the foreground fountain, is probably an allusion to Christ as the living water of God. The fountain is therefore the fountain of life, a reference to the promise of eternal life made possible by Christ's sacrifice. The last multi-year renovation of the altarpiece, completed in 2019, revealed the eyes of the Lamb as they were originally painted, and it raised quite a stir. We saw a barrage of tweets referring to the Lamb's humanoid eyes. Well, considering that Van Eyck's Mystic Lamb is an image of Christ, it was a natural idea for Van Eyck to depict it face on at the viewer and staring at them, even if it meant meeting both conditions required distorting a lamb's actual physiognomy. Now, moving on to the remaining panels on the lower register. From the outer edges of the lower panels, crowds converge toward the altar in the center, presenting a unified field across the 5 panels. From the left come figures known as the just judges, who are actually administrators and politicians. Right next to the just judges are the Knights of Christ, people who took up the sword in the name of Christ, following the medieval chivalric ideal. And remember that leftmost panel is the one that is a copy. It was, again, stolen and has never been found, has never been returned. To the right of the central panel, we find the hermits and the pilgrims, those who turned their backs on worldly pleasure in order to serve Christ. First come the hermits. They're joined in the background by the penitent Mary Magdalene, and she holds an ointment jar, and there's a companion with her. The outermost panel is devoted to the pilgrims, who were an important feature of medieval religiosity. They're led by Saint Christopher, the patron saint of pilgrims and travelers, and according to his legend, a giant. The background is that of a beautiful Mediterranean landscape, one of the altarpiece's greatest glories. This completes the story of the Ghent altarpiece. I hope our brief run through it has given you an appreciation as to why it created quite a stir right from the start. Now, moving along, Jan van Eyck completed the Arnolfini portrait 2 years later. But unlike the Ghent altarpiece, it remained in obscurity until it went on public display at the National Gallery in London in 1843, and immediately it began to demand attention. Since then, it's been an ongoing source of mystery for art historians and all who view it, beginning with the question of what the painting is actually depicting. Now, you may have learned of this portrait as the Arnolfini wedding portrait, and not without reason. In the first authoritative article on the painting, Erwin Panofsky, the art historian, in 1934, made the claim that the image is of a wedding ceremony between Giovanni di Arago Arnolfini and Jean de Cenami. But here's the rub. In 1990, a document came to light that certified that the wedding of Giovanni Arnolfini and Gianni Cenani occurred in 1447, 13 years after the portrait was painted and 6 years after the artist died. So that theory could no longer hold. So who are the people in this intimate setting? Well, the man is most likely Giovanni de Niccolo Arnolfini, who worked in Bruges, a thriving economic town in the early 15th century. The Arnolfini family built their wealth on the trade of luxury fabrics, and they were originally from the city of Lucca, Italy. The Arnolfinis may have been friends of Van Eyck. He painted another portrait of Giovanni de Niccolo the following year. The likeness of these two portraits supports the identification of this Arnolfini as being Giovanni de Niccolo Arnolfini and not his cousin, Giovanni di Arago, who he was for some time considered to be. And what about the woman? Well, a bit more controversy here. Some scholars have suggested that the work is a memorial portrait and that the woman on the right is Arnolfini's first wife, Costanza Trenta, who passed away in childbirth the previous year. The National Gallery, which owns the painting, probably represents the most authoritative view right now, or the most widely accepted, which is that the woman is Arnolfini's second wife, whose identity is unknown. Now, we're going to see as we go through the symbolism and the iconography that you can find support for either of these premises, that it's a memorial portrait or that this is Arnolfini's second wife. So what are we looking at? We see a richly dressed man and woman standing in a private room. Now, although it looks as if Jan van Eyck painted a real room exactly as he saw it, every object in its placement has been carefully chosen to proclaim the couple's wealth and social status. The large brass chandelier, the luxurious bed covered with expensive red woolen cloth, red cushions and fabric scattered on the bedside chair, and the bench. All of these represent wealth. But this isn't a bedroom, it's a reception room. And the bed, the most expensive item of furniture in the house, is an essential part of its furnishings, which the couple would have wanted to show off. More importantly, the clothing of the Arnolfinis showcases their wealth and status within society. Both are wearing clothes of costly material, trimmed with fur. And the answer is no, she's not pregnant. Other depictions from the 15th century inform us that holding up the excess dress fabric was the fashion of the time. The more material in your clothing, the wealthier you were seen to be. Furthermore, it allows her to show off her expensive blue underwear. And it's hard to overlook Arnolfini's strange straw hat, which is a stylish import. Because of the cherry tree outside the window and the presence of oranges, the Arnolfini portrait was likely painted during the springtime, yet the couple are wearing winter garments. Why is that? Well, it can be interpreted that the clothing they're wearing is not their everyday attire, but instead was used only for the painting of the portrait. They'd want to wear their best clothing. Establishing wealth through imagery was commonplace for people commissioning a portrait during this time. The oranges on the sill are another sign of wealth, as they would have had to have been imported. Van Eyck included orange trees in his landscape of the Ghent altarpiece, and probably saw them on his travels in the Iberian Peninsula. Visually, they contribute lively patches of color, which draw the eye to the otherwise dark lower left of the room and gives Van Eyck another opportunity to demonstrate his virtuoso technique. The oranges may symbolize virtue and guiltlessness that reigned in the Garden of Eden before the fall of man. The fruits on the tree at the window are frequently considered to symbolize sweetness and the fruits of paradise. Arnolfini, you'll notice, is closest to the window, representing his work duties of traveling and providing for the family. Meanwhile, his wife stands closest to the bed, representing her duties of caring for the home. Her placement near a brush hanging on a statue of Saint Margaret, the patron saint of childbirth, also signifies her wifely duties and supports the interpretation that this is a memoriam portrait for Costanza Trenta, whose death in the prior year may have been in childbirth. The elaborate brass chandelier, another indication of wealth, also supports the interpretation of this work as a memoriam portrait. The candle on the man's side is still whole and lit, while the opposite candle holder is empty, aside from a few drops of wax, signifying that the man's lifelight is still burning while hers has burned out. A single candle in the chandelier could also stand for the unity of the couple, and at the same time could be symbolic of the all-seeing eye of God. A little Brussels griffin stands in the foreground between the couple, the texture of his bushy coat delineated in the hairs that flare up around his alert expression. Most common is the interpretation that the dog represents the fidelity and loyalty of the married couple, but some scholars suggest that dogs are seen on female tombs from ancient Roman times, as they were believed to guard and guide them in the afterlife. This would explain why the dog stands closest to the female, representing her death. Now, not to be missed is the large, round, convex mirror, placed like an eye in the center of the composition. And it really adds to the mystery and the strangeness of this painting. The mirror has the effect of compressing the space, but expanding it at the same time and bringing the world outside the picture frame into the heart of the composition. Reflected in the mirror are the backs of Mr. and Mrs. Arnolfini, which you would expect. But then there's these two other figures standing in the doorway where we as the viewer would be standing. There's one in red and one in blue. Most critical thinking is that the man in red is Van Eyck himself, and the other either the viewer or his servant arriving for a visit. So you might remember Arnolfini's hand is raised, and you might ask the question, is his hand raised as a greeting to these visitors? A clue to consider is that above the mirror, as though written on the wall, is this extraordinary inscription in very elaborate writing, and it's in Latin and says, Jan van Eyck has been here, 1434, the date of the painting. So it's both a signature and perhaps an indication, not just that Jan van Eyck painted every inch of this picture, but that he's shown here just below, coming into the room. The mirror is decorated with scenes from the Passion of Christ and could represent the promise of salvation to the couple. One historian notes that the scenes of death and resurrection are located on the side of the female, while images of Christ's life are next to the male. By observing it through this perspective, it's seen as another indication that the portrait was intended for a memoriam of the woman featured. Now, I'd like you to consider that the room is not a literal record of the couple's home. I talked about this briefly in the beginning. Although it looks like Van Eyck has simply removed a wall, close examination reveals inconsistencies. The chandelier can't really fit into the space it seems to occupy, and Arnolfini is near eye level with it. The bed is too short, and the ornate convex mirror on the back wall seems impossibly large and placed so low compared to the figures that they would have had to bend down in order to use its reflection. But in fact, a mirror of this size was not possible to be made at this time. So as usual, Van Eyck created a perfectly convincing show of reality, but he altered things to fit his aesthetic purposes and perhaps also to accord with Arnolfini's aspirations. What just might be Jan van Eyck's greatest achievement with the Arnolfini portrait is that its mysteries, along with Van Eyck's masterful technique, continue to enthrall viewers well into its 6th century of existence. And it's a wonderful source for social media and recreations. And this image was posted on Instagram in 2020. This brings our tour to an end. I hope you enjoyed our deep dive into Van Eyck's magic and mystery. My sincere wish for all of you, for myself also, is that you have the opportunity to visit the Ghent Altarpiece in Belgium and the National Gallery in London to see these two works in person. I actually have seen the Arnolfini portrait, but definitely not the Ghent Altarpiece. And certainly I welcome any comments or questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eleanor. That was so informative. And yes, as Eleanor said, right now would be a great time if you have any questions. You can either feel free to unmute yourself and join in a dialogue, or you can use the chat feature as well, and I'll relay those questions for you.
If anyone in the group has seen the Ghent Altarpiece, I would love to hear your comments. And of course, the Arnolfini portrait. I mean, the Arnolfini portrait is quite small. You know, you're almost surprised, you know, after examining it. One reference I saw noted that those images around the convex mirror, the Passion of Christ images, are half the size of a fingernail. So Van Eyck could only have done them with like one, bristle of a brush, if that.
Yeah, I mean, I've always wanted to see the Arnolfini portrait, especially because studying art history in high school and then in college as well, it's talked about so much, and it's just the colors used are really pretty as well. And so I've always wanted to see it in person to see what it really looks like. But it looks like we have a couple questions in the chat. So the first is, was Jan van Eyck financially successful throughout his life?
He was actually. Yes, I had in a prior presentation, we looked at some of his religious works, his works in churches, and the Ghent altarpiece certainly brought him international renown. He lost it in later years and was rediscovered. So, he had great renown through his lifetime and afterwards. And then for a couple of centuries, he kind of came out of, I won't say out of favor, but, his renown was not as publicized, shall we say, and certainly in the last century, he is known certainly for his brilliance. He did not have a very long life, unfortunately. So we only have, again, 20, some people say 22, of his works. So we treasure every one of them. Oh, Kathy Dunn got to see the altarpiece on a river cruise. Wow, that's spectacular. What I understand now, and it's hard to know if you're seeing the most current vision of how the altarpiece is being displayed, but the best I know is that it's in a glass case and it's opened, so visitors can view both the front and the back. Someone said, I think this is the only artist who hasn't had any bad works. I think that's true. I mean, what also blows my mind is the iconography. I mean, you might say none of that symbolism, and iconography, Van Eyck didn't really think about that, but that's not true, because in that time, the use of symbolism and iconography was a standard part of painting. So it was assumed that there was meaning to, all of the objects in works.
There was one other question that we missed as the comments have been coming in, which is great. Thank you all so much for commenting. But somebody asked if you know anything about the pigments that Jan van Eyck used.
Not particularly, except that, and I recall this from other of his works that we've seen, that he did use the blue. He got that pigment from Asia, from Afghanistan. He definitely, he mixed the oil, so he was using and had to import, pigments. The red, I don't know if the red came from cochineal or, what the sources were, but he did mix his own pigments, and he used linseed oil. Apparently the use of linseed oil was what he attributed and what we can see that created much of the luminosity of the colors.
This is Dee Dee Hollowell. I wonder if you could focus again on the image of the God the Father, where the question is it God the Father? Is it Christ?
Yeah.
I have a comment of maybe it'll
yeah, sure.
Okay.
Let me go back.
Mm-hmm.
Up, there we are.
There we go.
Yes.
Yeah, there. If I had to have a vote, I'd go with God the Father. And why is that? First of all, I wanted to look at that crown at the bottom, whether it was a crown of thorns, but it seems to be just a regular crown with
Yes.
With jewels. So what
Yeah.
what I would say is that since the Lamb is below, and that is the whole point of the salvation story, the God the Father, amazingly to me, but I've seen it in other paintings as well, has this triple crown thing, which the Pope also wears. They called it at the time the papal tiara. We're now gone out of favor with the current Pope. He doesn't wear that kind of stuff. But so, you know, the ornateness of the figure, the fact that it's a triple crown, meaning consummate power, and the fact that there's another very splendid crown at the feet, and Mary is already crowned, so it's not for her. And so I was just going to throw in that I think it's God the Father. He looks, you know, Episcopal with the whole shooting match. And so just to say, I think I would go with that. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that's excellent evidence. And, you know, the difficulty with coming up with any definitive conclusion is it seems you can always find another art historian with another point of view. And without your singular authority to know, you defer to what seems to be the most common point. But I still was listening to videos and hearing people who were saying that the Arnolfinis were the cousin who got, you know, was still the couple who got married 13 years later. So people are still not, you know, even taking the evidence that is understood. But that your evidence is right on, Dee Dee.
Yeah.
Thank you.
He also has that scepter thing in his
Yes.
left hand. You know, it looks very powerful, like, you know, I mean, like ruler, like, you know, anyway. Okay.
Yeah, somebody, Becky asked, do we know what the inscriptions say in the arches above the figures of God, the Father, Mary, and John? I did not, Becky, I did not see anything that described that, but I'll take another look and get back to you if I can, you know, find that. Good question.
I just wanted to say thank you so much to everybody commenting about seeing the Ghent altarpiece. It's so cool to see how many people have actually seen it in person. That's really fun.
Yeah, they have. Those river cruises seem to do a good job of getting.
They do. They do. I've heard good things about the river cruises too. But I'm just checking to see if we missed any questions as the comments were coming in. Oh, I think there was one question about the dog and in the Arnolfini portrait, if it had any sort of symbolization of what was it? I'm trying to find the question. I think it was of faithfulness.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the most common representation of a dog in an image would be to represent fidelity and loyalty, which I think, you know, would equate to faithfulness. So that is the most agreed upon interpretation. The fact that he chose that dog with all of its hair, you know, he didn't have to paint a, you know, the griffin with those million pieces of hair on it.
There's one question that says, did he have a school? From A.
Did he have a school?
Yeah.
What? I'm not sure I understand the question.
I think maybe they're talking about if he had some kind of institution where he taught his painting techniques, or if it was.
No, he did not. He was not a teacher. Nothing I said referenced that. He himself had been, you know, as I said at the start, it was understood that he had a fair amount of schooling. He spoke 3 or 4 languages, so he was quite learned. So
there's one more question saying, was the detail of the open Bible being held by John the Baptist capable of being recognized?
The text on it?
I think so. I don't know, Andrea, if you want to clarify.
On the image that you have shown right now with Mary and whether it's Christ or the Father, and then John the Baptist is on the right, there's an open, I assume it's the Bible. Is the detail capable of showing what part of the Bible was being displayed?
I did not find anywhere a reference to the book, to the text.
I just wonder because his detail is so amazing that I wonder if it was capable of being recognized as a particular,
Yeah.
but not really. Did he have children that followed in his footsteps and became painters?
I do not know of any children. That's an excellent question. Unlike Bruegel, who set up a dynasty, I did not read. I mean, we do know a fair amount of this history, but I didn't, in no source was there a reference to children. So my assumption is he did not have children.
Do you know if he married?
I'm sorry?
Do we know if he married?
Yes, he was married.
Uh-huh. Okay.
Thank you so much, Andrea, for those questions. Those are great questions. I now too am thinking about whether or not the Bible would be, because I feel like it seems to be open to open for a reason. So I feel like maybe that would be interesting to look into specifically to see if you really can, or if I don't know, maybe if any of the people who have seen it in person were able to read it when they were there.
And you remember.
Yeah, exactly. So we have one other question about the painting of Eve that you showed us, and wondering if she's pregnant in that painting.
I'm trying to recall if I read anything to the affirmative that she was not pregnant. I did not read anything to reference that she was pregnant. And in fact, even though someone mentioned her body looks kind of strange, although I've seen other images from this time period representing her in a similar fashion. So my thinking is that Van Eyck has not represented her as being pregnant, or did not intend to represent her as such.
I can say one thing about that, which is only that a little bit of fat represented wealth and healthiness. So, if you were gaunt thin, that was not good. So for them, that was beautiful to have a little bit of flesh on you.
Yeah, good point.
Thank you so much, Dee Dee. So we're coming up on time here. If anybody has any last questions that they'd like to ask, this has been so nice to have a little conversation with all of you. I think Eleanor and I both really appreciate the participation. So feel free to ask any last questions you might have.
Well, I see someone did DS says that in the book that rests on the knees of John the Baptist, we make out the word that means take comfort, which begins a prophecy in the book of Isaiah that was interpreted in the Gospels as a reference to John the Baptist.
Oh, wow.
Wow. Kudos to you. And we have a link
for a citation.
Yes.
If anybody would like to do any more research.
Thank you.
Well, if there's no more questions, I want to thank everyone so much for coming today. And thank you, Eleanor, for sharing your knowledge with us and taking your time to give this wonderful presentation for us. Thank you all so much for coming and for participating. It's always awesome when we can have these kinds of discussions. I do just want to say that if you loved this presentation and would love to come to another one, we have another presentation next Thursday as well, which is going to be given by another docent, and it's entitled 17th Century Dutch Painting in Haarlem. So if you would like, that's going to be at 11 a.m. next Thursday.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you all so much.
Bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.